Hello there, welcome to History on the Road. My name is Sebastian, and today, for my first video ever, I welcome you to the town of La Ceja, in the department of Antioquia, Colombia. Here we have a peaceful and traditional Colombian town full of life, a place where people ride their bikes to go to work and gather in the town square to mingle and enjoy their evenings and weekends. Here, it's also pretty common to see livestock breeding and flower growing, which are deep-rooted in the town's identity and are still some of the main job providers in the area. Now, this town's never really been known for any historical events nationwide. At least nothing that people really care about. It doesn't seem like much has taken place around here. If one Googles information about the town's history, there's not much you can get your hands on, and what little there is does not provide much context, just isolated pieces of data. Now, to be fair, the town's archives burnt down, as I was kindly informed by a librarian from one of La Ceja's libraries, but fortunately I was able to get my hands on what at the time seemed to be the only other source of information, a book called Monografías de la Ceja, and there we can find all sorts of historical little nuggets about the place, how it was founded. It talks also about what happened to natives during colonial times here, as well as friendly border disputes with nearby towns. Now, the thing I found that I wanted to talk to you about is something that actually it's rather sad and unfortunate, and we don't really learn about it here at school, and I think most locals in this town don't know about it. And what I'm referring to is the looting of La Ceja of 1885. Now, before we get into it, let's quickly see the context in which this situation developed. In the month of August of the year 1884, an armed conflict erupted in the nation. Popularly known as the 1885 War, the year in which it ended, this period of violence was the result of clashes and political discord between the radical liberals, who had been in power for the past 22 years, so 1863 to 1885, against the conservatives and the independent liberals. This particular disagreement stemmed from the fact that the newly elected president, Rafael Núñez, an independent liberal himself, had been pushing for years now for reform and structural change of the country's radical federal constitution in order to bring about a more centralized one, where, in his eyes, the church, public order, and a more authoritarian government would result in a much more cohesive and less disorderly nation. Said process would be known as la regeneración, which in Spanish means the regeneration. There's even a quote from the man himself that highlights how strongly he believed this to be the right path for Colombia. Regeneración administrativa fundamental o catástrofe, which means fundamental administrative regeneration or catastrophe. As he told the, at the time, President of the United States of Colombia, Julián Trujillo, in 1878, while himself being President of the Senate. For the radical liberals, this was an absolute betrayal of everything they believed in, these being things like separation of church and state, laissez-faire, and federalism. Having said all that, the 1885 war is obviously much deeper and complex than what I just mentioned, so it definitely deserves its own video in order to explain all that happened before, during, and after it, as well as its consequences for the nation. But the short version, and what will take us to today's subject, goes as follows. On June the 17th of 1885, the radical liberals lost the war after the Battle of La Humareda, which resulted in Pyrrhic victory for them, but was followed later on by strategic mistakes on their end. This resulted from the lack of capitalization of the weakened and almost defeated enemy. The battle took place in what is known today as the municipality of El Banco in the department of Magdalena, north of the country. Not long after this, Ricardo Gaetano Beso, the radicals' most popular general, was detained on August the 20th. By then, most of his liberal partners had already signed the government's peace agreement, and soon after, President Núñez declared in a speech to a crowd in Bogota, the 1863 Constitution no longer exists. Núñez, apparently, also wanted Gaitán shot, since he was rather popular with a certain portion of the population, and therefore keeping him around was, in his opinion, a big risk. Fortunately for Gaitán, he still had some allies in the military who were looking out for him, and thanks to this, he went from the death penalty to exile, specifically to Panama. Now, unfortunately for him though, death was still able to reach him there, some say via poisoning, ordered by the Colombian government. When it comes to Antioquia's involvement in the war, it was rather short. They were knocked out of it pretty quickly. They were defeated at the Battle of Santa Bárbara de Cartago, in which the Antiochian army's demise partly pushed their state to completely surrender to the forces of General Juan N. Mateus. They also lost the Battle of Salamines, which took place on February the 18th of 1885, when the conservatives' vanguard met with a radical outpost comprised of 400 men who were holding the Alto de La Palma, or Heights of La Palma, near Salamina. According to the conservatives' account for Mateus's army, the casualties were 3 dead and 9 wounded, while the radicals had 9 dead and 16 wounded, as well as losing many weapons and ammunition. On the other hand, there's the Antiochian and liberal version of events, as told by historian Luis Latorre Mendoza, who claims that the conservative side had 4,000 soldiers, while the radical side had just the Ayacucho battalion, comprised of only 250 troops, mostly city dwellers who supposedly weren't good soldier material because of it, or at least not as good as people from the countryside. And therefore he would go on to say, "De este combate de Salamina ha de hablarse con toda la reverencia que el heroísmo inspira," which means, this combat of Salamina must be spoken of with all the reverence that heroism inspires, given the supposed bravery the radicals showed despite the imparity of the encounter. Salamina would soon be surrendered to the conservatives on February the 20th. Both battles were decisive losses, and according to historian and at the time general in the 1885 war, Pedro Sicard Briceño, the Antiochian president Luciano Restrepo, who was in Manizales at the time with 1,000 men, decided to dispatch some envoys to offer capitulation to the conservatives, which was accepted by the latter. Despite Antiochia's surrender during the early stages of the war, violence and confrontations did not completely cease. Radical splinter groups continued harassing government troops, some through the use of guerrilla warfare, others used more common ways of waging war and decided to directly attack strongpoints. Among these, one such, Cándido Tolosa, stood out from the rest. He was the leader of 300 radical liberals who raised arms against the government once more. This despite the fact that he had been among the first ones to capitulate. A former jail warden in Medellin turned general, Cándido Tolosa is one of the lesser-known radical leaders, or at least from what I've gathered in my research, there's not a whole lot of information about him out there. Tolosa was born in Somondoko, today located in the department of Boyacá, in 1848. He had his first experience with war at the age of 12, and due to his merits and achievements, he was able to continue getting more promotions while the civil wars of the second half of the 19th century raged on. At one point, he and Rafael Uribe were the heads of a club called La Mano Negra, or the Black Hand in English, which made political opposition to the conservatives and the old ways of governance via intimidation tactics and murders, or at least that's what was speculated at the time. Uribe, by the way, was one of the most important political and military figures from the conflict, one of the main radical leaders who, under the pressure of Luciano Restrepo's orders, dissolved the forces that accompanied him, while also deciding on his own to bury 200 Remington rifles with their ammunition, to then flee to hide in El Retiro, an estate that belonged to his grandmother. Once caught, and from the jail he was in, Rafael Uribe had someone indicate Cándido Tolosa the place in which the weapons were buried, and prompted him to continue the fight for the Radical Party, which resulted in the atrocities that later took place in Rio Negro and La Ceja. During the war, he led the Trujillo Division as a commanding general. On March the 16th of 1885, he pronounced himself. Following this, on June the 30th of the same year, he attacked a garrison in the city of Rio Negro. But, unbeknownst to him, people of the city had gotten word of his presence in a place called El Tablazo, and of the fact that he had plenty of people with him, all well armed. Now, even though the government's forces considered an attack on Rio Negro impossible, they still went on high alert mode, using as many able-bodied men as they could muster, as well as sending out night guards to patrol the surrounding areas, just in case. After a quiet night, around 4 a.m., government troops were heard retreating in disarray towards the town square while shooting back. It was Tolosa. He had started his attack and was chasing the troops initially placed on the outskirts of the city. With regards to the number of defenders, it varies depending on the source, ranging from 70 to 95 to one account in which it was said there were 1,000 defenders. That last one in particular, I think we can ignore confidently, given the consistent numbers for Tolosa's forces of around 300 to 315 men, which, even if they happen to be extremely talented soldiers, still, under the orders of most generals, would struggle immensely in order to take a fortified city with over 3 times the amount of defenders. Once the retreating forces reached the town square, they took defensive positions. Tolosa then reached said positions with his men, most of them actually being from Rio Negro itself. The majority of the latter mentioned radicals were armed with 18-shot carbines. These were the weapons that had been hidden by Rafael Uribe before being arrested by the new government. The defenders, on the other hand, were armed regularly. Once fighting ensued at the center of the population, having reached all 4 corners of the town square, the assailants initiated melee or face-to-face combat with some of the defending forces, while others held their positions from their fortifications. The fighting lasted until late in the morning according to one source, until 9 according to another one. Don Miguel Tobon, a radical military man that participated in the fight, said that Rio Negro's defenders eventually had to surrender to Tolosa despite their biggest efforts to keep their fortifications due to a lack of ammunition. With this, the first part of the battle for Rio Negro had ended. The radicals took this opportunity to release over 50 incarcerated prisoners from jail in order to make room for the defeated conservatives that were captured after the fight. Among the released criminals and prisoners, some decided to join Tolosa's lines, while others decided to escape. not without raiding the government's public offices first, as well as destroying any and all records and documents regarding their criminal history before leaving. Later that day at 1 p.m., the second part of the battle took place, the so-called Batalla del Cementerio, or Battle for the Cemetery. This time there were conservative reinforcements, but even then they couldn't make much of a difference, and by the end of the evening, after fierce face-to-face combat with machetes, the field was littered with corpses, mainly of government soldiers. The Liberal casualties were relatively low. At this point, the lack of ammunition forced a retreat of the conservative forces. Come nighttime, and Talassus's men returned to the city after the battle. They have been successful in the battlefield, and yet despite this, they deemed it unwise to remain in the city due to the fact that the eastern government forces were closing in on them, and they feared that the last troops they defeated would regroup with the help of fresh reinforcements from Medellin to then surround them in the middle of the night inside the city. Talassus's forces, therefore, completely abandoned Rio Negro the next morning, on July the 1st, and headed towards the town of Jericó, going through San Antonio, La Ceja, El Retiro, Santa Bárbara, and Támesis. And so, we finally reached the dreadful events that took place in La Ceja. Having achieved victory in Rio Negro, Talassus's men felt triumphant, and therefore deserving of the spoils of war, a fitting prize for their bravery. Unfortunately for the inhabitants of La Ceja, their town would be the place where the radicals would satiate such desires by pillaging it. Rafael C. Uribe, an eyewitness, attested to this during a judicial interrogation on July the 9th of 1885. According to Uribe's account, he tried to step in and stop the radicals from stealing from several houses, but it was to no avail, because, as Tolosa argued, it was very difficult to contain his men. It was accepted by many generals and military men at the time that loot was inherently a part of war, and that stopping soldiers from getting it would result in mutinies, disorganization, and the loss of discipline among the ranks. On July the 1st, at around 10 in the morning, the force commanded by Tolosa entered the district of La Ceja. They reached the plaza or town square and then started shooting in order to spread fear among the inhabitants, who did not oppose any armed resistance, and so the pillaging began. When Uribe and one of Talassus's underlings tried stopping some of the soldiers from robbing and destroying houses, the latter sheltered their actions under the excuse of performing the allanamiento detenido, or in English, arrested trespassing or arrested raid. Also, it could be detained trespassing or detained raid. This was done according to the looters in order to look for arms and weapons. Now, the source I mentioned at the very beginning, the Monografía de la Ceja by Don Benjamín Bernal B., had two detailed accounts of what happened. One by the aforementioned Rafael C. Uribe, and the other one by Juan P. Bernal, who, as he admits in his account, was not there when it happened but after. According to him, the information about this tragedy was provided by the most trustworthy citizens, and therefore it had to be true. The following is a literal translation of both accounts, and before you chastise me, please know that I'm not a professional translator or interpreter. I did my very best to get it as accurate as possible, yet I'm pretty confident I made some mistakes, so I'll leave the original account in Spanish somewhere in the comment section, and if anyone who's interested decides to check it and notices said mistakes, feel free to leave your constructive criticism and potential corrections down below. Thank you very much. The first of the month, at 10 a.m. more or less, the force commanded by Candido Tolosa entered the department of La Ceja. When they entered the plaza, they started shooting many shots to instill terror in those inhabitants of the population in which they had no armed enemy. At that time, I was in one of the corners of the town square, where I headed towards the door of my house, situated in that same town square. Being there, I saw that a group of soldiers hastily entered the house of Mr. Felix Botero, to which I headed in the company of Clemente Chavez, subordinate officer of Tolosa. And when we arrived, we found the soldiers stealing some objects from the house, among which I remember, if I'm not mistaken, a leather purse, a ruana, and a sombrero. Myself, as a liberal that I was, felt ashamed of such excesses, and so I excited Chavez to impede them, and with his support I managed to take away said objects and to expel from there that group of soldiers, while warning Mrs. de Botero to close the door after they did the arrested trespassing, supposedly to look for weapons. While living there, I witnessed that another group was committed to breaking in a door and a window with the butt of their rifles on Mr. Rafael Angels' house, located in the same town square. I hastily ran over there in the company of Chavez, and when we arrived they had already penetrated and were force opening wardrobes and stealing as much as they could. With a lot of difficulty, while reprimanding their undignified proceedings, Chavez and I managed to throw them out of there, but not without them taking some objects like dressing gowns, bed sheets, etc. Immediately they came in again. I don't know if the same ones or others, and then I happened upon their boss, Tolosa, whom despite showing little energy and protesting about the difficulty of holding back soldiers without organization, did not excuse himself from accompanying me and encouraging them not to steal and to leave. But despite not presenting any obedience, we finally managed to have them abandon said house, taking with them as much as they could. I went off to the street known as Las Mejias, where I found the houses of Mr. Juan de Botero, Mrs. Maria Antonia Mejia de G, Mr. Pedro Pablo Bernal, and Mr. Antonio Jose Jaramillo, being invaded in the middle of the horrible hubbub, destroying furniture and stealing as much as they found. I made the biggest effort trying to contain them. We entered the aforementioned houses randomly, confronting them all for their disgraced conduct and grabbing from them as much as we could of the stolen objects, but all this to no avail, because by mutual agreement they were frantically fixated in pillaging and destruction, and whatever I could take from the hands of one, another one would rip off mine. Disheartened now, for how fruitless my labor had been, and horribly alarmed by so many offenses, I left said street in the direction of the town square, and when I went by Mr. Rafael A. Elejadez's house, I decided to go inside, because earlier, back in the town, some ladies had told me that the soldiers had been breaking in a door there. Indeed, I found them in some rooms stealing women's clothes and everything else they found, for which I dared to energetically confront them about their wrongdoings, but further from understanding, they took hostile action against me, getting their guns into their hands and threatening me with them. I understood that my life was not very safe with such outlaws, and I left
full of fear, towards the town square, where I saw that Mr. Elejalde's store had been completely robbed. They had taken as much merchandise as there was, and even the account-keeping books, with us not being able to find any of it in the hands of the soldiers, because everything had disappeared. At this moment they were trying to break in the door of Mr. Eduardo Villegas' house, which was next to the pharmacy of Federico Latorre, a son-in-law of mine, but I managed with great effort to keep them from knowing that. Then I noticed that the house of Mr. Rafael Angel found itself invaded for the third time. I penetrated into it and had the misfortune of observing that what little had escaped previous groups had been totally destroyed by the last one, not even sparing a counter from the dining room, of which I witnessed its destruction. Tired by now of so much running and horrified by such black crimes, I appealed to the last resource, which was that of heading towards Tolosa, who by then was in the town square, and whom I had not seen in hours by now, to tell him that it was not prudent for him to remain any longer in such place, because the enemy was likely approximating, and if he was surprised in the middle of such disorder, he should consider himself completely defeated. This coincided with the arrival of a spy who announced having left the government forces which were heading towards this city, and had already reached a place called La Bolsa. This produced a good effect, because not long after I noticed they were starting to disappear, with the population being deoccupied because of this by around 2 to 3 in the afternoon. Besides the houses involved, I witnessed Mrs. Isabel Arangos' house being pillaged, and I know that the same disgrace was endured by the houses of Mr. Manuel Villegas, Justo Pastor Mejia, Juan de Dios Bernal, who died defending Rio Negro's town square, Salustiano Giraldo, and Maria Pia Marulanda de B, for I saw them pillaged after their departure. I also found out, because I was told, that those of Idelfonso Cardona, Eusebio Mejia M, and Primitivo Valencia were completely pillaged, and all this without counting the robberies committed in other houses that were not subjected to rigorous pillaging. I did not get to know any of the thieves by their names. My very esteemed friend, despite being penetrated by the deepest pain and emotion considering what happened in La Ceja on the first day of the month, it is my duty to make a list of the events that took place there in that ill-fated day, so that you can make it be published and so it reaches everyone's knowledge. Among the innumerable and unnameable scandalous deeds verified in our beloved La Ceja, there are, in the highest degree, the following ones, of which I personally know to be true, since I was in the location where they happened after they did. The house is inhabited by Mr. Rafael Ángel, Rafaela Elijalde, María Antonia Mejía de G, Antonio J. Jaramillo, Jorge, and Pedro P. Bernal, in which, besides the necessary commodities for life, there was also pleasure, enjoyment, and abundance, were left in such a ruinous state that, having been thrown out of them, their dwellers had to go borrow dressing gowns to present themselves in public, both mothers as well as their sons and daughters, and by request a blanket with which to cover from the cold their beloved little ones. All furniture, tools, and belongings, precious objects and ornaments from the aforementioned houses were broken and completely destroyed. Doors and windows broken and destroyed, even if the first ones mentioned were already open and with the key in their locks. The tables, platforms, and stools totally broken. Showcases and cupboards reduced to small pieces. Wallpapers stabbed, as if to avenge in them the grievances inferred by the offensive walls. All in all, nothing, absolutely nothing, has remained in the aforementioned houses. In the house of Mr. Protasio Bernal, residency of the unfortunate Captain Juan de Dios Bernal, the bandits' cruelty was such that, not happy with capturing the first one, an old man, harmless and entirely detached from political movements, they insulted him and treated him wickedly. They insulted the widow and reduced the room to rubble, to such extent that, when the aforementioned knew about the death of her husband, hidden from her until then, she did not find in the house where to lean on to release her crying, not even a piece of cloth to cover herself with, nor a bite of bread for her and her poor children. In the houses of the gentleman Mr. Joaquín Ángel, Juan de Botero, Justo Pastor Mejía, Isabel Arango, Pia de Marulanda, and Manuel Villegas, similar acts to the previous one took place. In the sum, the recount of all that happened would be the object of an extensively injurious as well as sad and unpleasant narration. A subject whose name I'll keep to myself in order to avoid susceptibilities and displeasures, but that I'll publish if necessary, had the impudence and the nerve of going to our house's state, commanding a few men with their chief's temper, and said to the woman of one of the butlers that, although with much regret, they were going to take all the beasts that they could find, because the prefect had supposedly stolen everything he had. Having said that, I don't even know the individual, nor who he could be, nor have I had any business with a subject of such reputation, and to that effect, they took 17 beasts and everything they found in the house. But the most scandalous act, and the one that gives a clear idea of the perversity of the evildoers I am referring to, is the incurred defiling of the sacred image of crucified Jesus Christ in the house of Primitivo Valencia, also known as Varguitas. After pillaging it like the previous ones, they only left the aforementioned image to avoid taking it away and to make a mockery out of everything that is holy and sacred. They threw it under a bed, and they smeared cheese onto it, and they put cheese next to it, one of the stolen ones, of course, so that he could eat, uttering expressions such as these: "Eat, you bastard, so that you can endure. Come, maldito, para que puedas aguantar. Suck it for being a godo, you demon. Chupa por godo, demonio." This is what can be said about these demoniac abortions of hell, were capable of slapping with such disregard the beliefs of a free people, and to insult, while facing the world, the rights of the associates, and their religious and social ideas. What has been said would be enough to judge the cruelty and ferocity of the crewmen who carried out the pillaging. In the houses of the gentlemen Presbyter Genaro Arroyave, Severo Gutierrez, José Miguel Mejía, José R. Rodríguez, Eugenio Chica, Erasmo Ángel, José Antonio Puerta, Juan M. López, Remigio Cardona, and Paulina Baena, and many more establishments and grocery stores. They stole all they could, and they asked for some things to pay them back later, which of course they did not do. But enough narrations. The sights of that horrific picture of desolation, the horrors and the infamies committed in La Ceja, causes such fright and indignation that the memory resists and the pen resists to write, regardless of how true the acts being talked about are. Deep sadness I feel for not being able to make any other honorable exceptions from among Tolosas' partners, other than Mr. Clemente Chavez, who, to be honest, was interested, even though in vain, in avoiding its party the ignominy of such shameless larceny, and who, according to what I've been told, left the gang of bandits because of said reason. Finally, and in order to finish this insipid and heavy narration, I must mention that the material losses caused to La Ceja this time go past 20,000. Thank you for asking, and that is without counting the unrest, troubles, and anxieties caused by such a rampant mob. I can attest to all these deeds, for I saw many of them, and I heard talk about the other ones from people worthy of full credibility and unbiased. As I learn about other facts, I will let you know. Your friend and servant, La Ceja, July the 5th of 1885, Juan P. Bernal. And so Tolosa would exit La Ceja, as mentioned in the previous accounts, to then go through El Retiro, Santa Bárbara, Támesis, and eventually reach Jericó, where he would finally be defeated by Marceliano Vélez and his subordinate General Julio Campo on July the 6th at around 2:30 p.m. That wouldn't be his end though. Tolosa would again fight in the subsequent and devastating 1,000 Days War, more specifically in Concepcion. There he would defeat General Ricardo Lesmes and General Posada. He also led the fighting in Yarumito and in the pass of the Cañón de Occidente, or Occident's Canyon, also Canyon of the West, as well as the defense of Chocó and the north of the Cauca state. In the year 1901, he became the military and civil leader of Chocó. Then, after the war ended in 1903, General Tolosa settled in Antioquia, where he started a family with Mrs. Hermilda Velázquez Echeverri. There he died in the year 1924. Now, it is rather astonishing that the state of Antioquia, despite having been defeated, was still giving the official government trouble, even if it wasn't a huge threat at first glance, since again, Tolosa's men were rather few in number, yet the reason why they still managed to create so much chaos was rather simple, and a bit silly, at least if you look at it through a purely logical and strategy-driven lens. Basically, during the surrender of the Antiochian radicals, the official government allowed some of their higher-ups to keep their guns, and in some cases, even their mount, meaning their horses. In Antioquia, the radicals had decided to surrender to General Mateus, since this would be better for them than allowing the Caucan, Eliseo Payan, to march on Medellin and claim reparations for the costs of war. Mateus, on the other hand, would at least allow them to capitulate with honor while letting them keep their kit. This capitulation included all rebel troops in the state of Antioquia. The terms were very generous, yet clear and decisive. It was also in Mateus's best interest to get them to surrender to him, since such a victory would result in substantial political and military currency for him in the near future, hence the concessions he made with the radicals' officials. Having said that, there wasn't much Mateus could do regarding the indemnification the radicals would have to pay the government, which amounted to 2 million pesos of the time. Needless to say, the capitulation was only partly fulfilled, both because of Mateus's deal as well as carelessness and lenity from the authorities, which resulted in many revolutionaries living with their firearms and equipment, which in turn eventually produced more revolts. Militarily speaking, the conservatives didn't really have to do much. No big battles took place, and their tasks had more to do with dealing with small bursts of violence across the Antiochian state. They did not consider these new combatants as political enemies, but instead as bandoliers and criminals, since, from their perspective, the Antiochian state had already officially surrendered. Therefore, the new fighters were nothing more than troublemakers. The lack of unity of the Antiochian army definitely did not help the situation. At one point during the conflict, Tolosa even put 2 of his generals in jail, supposedly because the army was mined with traitors that needed to be purged. While, on the other hand, said generals claimed that Tolosa was trying to get them out of the way, in order to give their positions to his friends and allies for later political gain. Regardless of which version is true, the bottom line is that this volatility and disarray inside the Antiochian lines only worsened their already precarious situation. And so we end this first video, exploring a little bit of the forgotten history of Colombia, and more so of a small and calm town where most of us never even considered something like this to have ever happened. It's an interesting glimpse into the past that shows what, unfortunately, many generations of Colombians have experienced throughout the years, one of innumerable turbulent episodes that most definitely shaped the culture and idiosyncrasy of generations to come, and in turn, the future conflicts, which, by the way, may not have stemmed from the same ideological or political roots necessarily, depending on the specific conflict or war we're talking about, but that have, to some extent, been tainted with this now generational, almost partisan-like divide that seems to split up the population every time there's turmoil into red team and blue team, and for some reason keeps the people from forming a united front against a specific issue, regardless of their political ideology. Thank you very much for sticking until the end of the video. I really appreciate it. Worked really hard on this. First time I ever do something like this. No idea how to edit videos, so I'm just learning as I went along. So yeah, this is the first one. The first one of hopefully many to come in the future. And yeah, really appreciate you sticking till the end of the video. Any constructive criticism is more than welcome. You can leave it in the comment section down below. And yeah, if you dug it, share it. If not, then thank you again. Goodbye.